Okay, good afternoon, and thanks for joining us today on the webinar on gendered Islamophobia. My name is Shirley. I am with the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence, and we are helping to host and facilitate today's webinar. I just have a couple of things to cover before I turn it over to your amazing presenters today. Just some things about Zoom. So we do have live captioning today. You'll see at the bottom of your screen a little box that says CC. If you click that, it'll give you the options for size and all that. If you have any questions throughout the webinar, feel free to put them in the chat box or the Q&A box. Both are at the bottom of your screen. If you are typing in the chat box, remember to switch it from to all presenters to all attendees and presenters. I think all presenters is default, so just switch it out if you're, just to make sure your chat is going to the right person. It is a public chat box, so make sure not to put any private or confidential information in there. Also, feel free to share any reflections or thoughts or resources that you may have and want to offer to the group. The presenters will do their best to either respond to your question directly or answer it live. This webinar will be recorded and we will share it with everybody afterwards, including the slides. If you have any questions, you can go ahead and just type it in the chat box. Questions about tech or audio or anything like that, you can go ahead and also type it in and I will do my best to respond to you. I am going to not take any more time away from the presentation today and turn it over to your presenters. Thank you, guys.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sahar. I go by she, her, hers pronouns, and I'm with HEART. We are a reproductive justice organization serving Muslim communities across the US. And I'm going to ask Nadia if you could share your screen. We've put together a really exciting presentation for you all today talking about gendered Islamophobia. And so we're first going to start out with just kind of some introductions about who we are, the work that we do, and then we'll lead us into a grounding. And you will hear the background soundtrack of my toddler. This is life working from home in quarantine. And if we're going to be real about being aligned with reproductive justice, that means including children in our movements. So that's my not so gentle disclaimer. So for today, and Nadia, if you could go to the next slide, please. So I want to just start out by sharing how the Partnership to End Gendered Islamophobia came together. So as I said, I'm Sahar from HEART. HEART is a national organization. I'm actually based out of the West Coast in Los Angeles. And I've been working kind of at this intersection with HEART around the gender-based violence movement space, as well as the anti-Islamophobia movement space. So as working with Muslim communities who are impacted by Islamophobia, both at the interpersonal level and at the structural level, the lives of survivors of gender-based violence are impacted by Islamophobia. So, HEART has seen itself kind of working at this intersection. Similarly, the Raksha, who you'll meet in a second, with Justice for Muslims Collective, has been working in the DC area in this field at the intersection. And then Yazin, who's with Vigilant Love, also based out of Los Angeles, has seen themselves kind of serving refugee communities and other folks who are impacted, again, by multiple layers of oppression. And so we really thought, we're all working on these similar issues. Why don't we all come together to form a partnership and be intentional about naming that intersection? And so that's how the partnership came together. And we've been so blessed to work in partnership with each other since, I think now it's been over a year. Actually, no, it's been longer than that. We started in October of 2019, maybe, I don't know. It was when I was still expecting with my toddler, and then I took a break, and then we came back and we're like, we're going to do all these amazing things. So it's been a few years. And last year we saw tremendous growth in the kind of coalition that we're building. And I'm going to pass it now to the Raksha to talk a little bit about herself and the work that she does.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you so much to the brilliant Sahar for opening us and also to API-GBV. I just want to say that I'm looking at the number of participants and it's over 100 people. This is a huge moment. As someone who has been doing this work now for about 10 years, there was a time when people did not even care when it comes to Muslim women and survivors. And so I just want to say this is a real momentous moment to see the level of interest on this webinar and also to see this work being crystallized to build movement, to build coalitions. And so for that, I'm really grateful. Just sharing a little bit about my journey in terms of how I got into this. 10 years ago, I was a direct services provider advocate within the DV courts. And it is actually within those DV courts that I saw Muslim women being totally treated differentially. The fact that they were Muslim women was being used against them by direct services providers to screen them out to receiving support. And so really this work that we are doing comes from our work on the ground, but mostly like want to honor the survivors, the strong folks that have come forth and forward to really, shape this. So I really want to ground it in that. I'm with Justice for Muslims Collective. We are a community-based organization in the DC area, and our work is to mainly fight structural and institutionalized forms of Islamophobia by building the power of Muslim communities. And, for us, gender justice and gendered Islamophobia is an integral part of that fight. We cannot achieve liberation and collective liberation for our folks if we do not also dismantle gendered forms of Islamophobia and also center survivors, particularly Muslim survivors of violence who are navigating violence at multiple different intersections. So with that, I'm actually gonna pass it on to our other incredible anchor, Yazin, who's also here. Yazin, please introduce yourself.
Hi folks, my name is Yazan. My pronouns are they, them, and I am the community organizer at Vigilant Love. Vigilant Love is a solidarity and healing justice organization based out of Los Angeles, California. A lot of our work originated with looking at the overlaps between the experiences of Japanese Americans during World War II and the policy and structural impacts on Muslim communities in the wake of 9/11. And at the current moment, a lot of our work focuses on the structural, policy, and interpersonal impacts of Islamophobia on Muslim communities, specifically in regards to surveillance. So our participation in this coalition comes from looking at how the war on terror, how surveillance programs, and how other governmental practices specifically use gender as a leverage point to marginalize and oppress Muslim women, and also restrict organizing in Muslim communities and in communities that are racialized as Muslim. And I also personally have worked for a few years in San Diego with the predominantly Syrian and Iraqi refugee community in El Cajon. A lot of my own work really looks at the relationship between war, surveillance, and social welfare. I'm really excited to be here, really grateful to be here. And yeah, pass it back.
Thanks, Yazan. So we did want to start today with a little bit of a grounding, and we're going to invite folks to, if you don't already know, please use the link in the chat box to look up what land you're currently occupying. So I myself am talking from Los Angeles, which is occupied Tongva land. So just want to acknowledge the original keepers of the land that we're on. And, it's also, Fridays are such sacred days for us who identify as Muslim. It's also, and I'm not sure, like different calendars say different things, but either yesterday was Isra and Maraj or today is Isra and Maraj. Either way, it is really such a sacred day to be talking about this work. And so we just want to acknowledge for folks who are Muslim identified in the space, Jummah Mubarak. It is Friday. And so we want to start, if you want to join me in this grounding, everything that I say is an invitation. So take what works for you, leave what doesn't. So feel free to plant your feet firmly on the ground. And if you want to kind of scooch your tush back into your seat and really feel the connection of your legs wherever you're seated. And then extend your head and just roll your shoulders back. Maybe it feels good to just drop your chin over to your chest. Maybe roll your left ear to your left shoulder. Bring your chin back to the center. Your right ear to your right shoulder. Just stretching ever so gently, acknowledging that this work takes a lot out of us, and we've made it to Friday. We're almost at the weekend, whatever that means in quarantine. Just take a deep breath of gratitude, inhaling in from the nose and exhaling out from the mouth. Inhaling in from the nose once more and exhaling out from the mouth. If you notice any sort of tension in your body, whether that be your shoulders, your back, your throat, your chest. Right now I'm feeling some in my arms. Just show that tension some gratitude. Our bodies are amazing vessels that try to tell us what's going on. So just appreciate that. And if it feels good to release any sort of tension through your breath, please do so. Whenever you feel good to come back to the space, noticing all of the sounds that might be surrounding you and me, come on back. So that was our gentle grounding for today, so that we can really be present with this conversation that is so important. And thank you for those who also dropped in what land you are occupying. And we're gonna pass it back to Dhraksha now.
Thank you so much, Seher, for that incredible grounding. Before I begin, I do want to set some expectations with this webinar. We are just dipping our toes on what is gendered Islamophobia. We're not doing a major deep dive. If you are interested in that major deep dive, please reach out to us. We would love to work with you and your group individually to do a much more deeper, day long, 2 days long, because again, this is a really complicated topic. And so we want to set just this expectation that we're just dipping our toes today into what is gendered Islamophobia and ways that it manifests. So wanted to say that. Also, we know we have a huge group of people here. So again, we want to build a space that is absolutely one where we want to learn together. And so, use this as an opportunity to also flex a little bit in terms of, push yourself around your own analysis, around maybe some new thoughts and ways of looking at gendered Islamophobia that you may not have thought about before. So with that, the first question that I want to put in the chat just to see how folks are is we have a question and a prompt around, what are your perceptions of Islam and gender? So we will put that in the chat for you and take the next 2 minutes just to see what comes to your mind, the first thing that comes to your mind. And so share that in the chat and I will go ahead and put it in here. Hmm. Okay, folks, giving y'all 1 more minute, and please do read the responses coming into the chat. Mm-hmm. Okay, all right. Please feel free to put in the chat, but I think if you're looking at some of these responses coming in, which by the way are quite broad, which is great because obviously depending on who you are, how much, whether you're Muslim yourself, whether you're someone who is actually going through gendered Islamophobia, or whether you're outside of the community, there's a whole host of just responses that are coming in. But one particular theme that I really want to pull from some of the responses that are coming in is around the negative perceptions of Islam, around gender, around patriarchy, around the role of women. And the reason I really want to, use that as one of the themes is because these perceptions of Muslim women or Islam or Muslim communities are constructed, and they're constructed by folks in power in order to push certain kind of policies, in order to keep certain kind of inequities within place. So why is it that the negative perception of Muslim women being seen as, or the negative perception of Islam as seen as patriarchal, why is that important? Well, it's important because it shapes not only social attitudes, it shapes social behaviors, but it also allows for there to be a space that is accepting of punitive responses from the state. And so that's the other kind of point I really want to pull out here, is that the state is deeply invested in creating, particularly within the context of the United States that has been waging a war on terror that is built upon anti-Black racism, settler colonial violence, that the dehumanization and negative perceptions of Islam and Muslim communities and Muslim women and just gender, Islam and gender, that they shape a certain agenda and allow for that. So with that, I'm going to go into how we define gendered Islamophobia. And of course, I just want to caveat this by saying that this is one definition. I'm not claiming that it is the definition. There are other groups out there that have different forms and different types of definition, but at Justice for Muslims Collective, we built this based upon being in community with direct services providers, Muslim survivors, and frankly, a lot of work that particularly Muslim women have been doing for a very long time, naming this form of violence as a distinct form that needs to be acknowledged as well as to be organized against. So I don't know who's doing slides, but I would love it if we could get to the next part. Great. So in terms of just a broad ways that we define gendered Islamophobia, so we define it as gendered Islamophobia consists of the ways the state utilizes gendered forms of violence. So that is anywhere from rape as a weapon of war, reproductive access and violence, reproductive violence, anything from gender inequity in terms of banning the niqab or banning the hijab, or really keeping Muslim women out of multiple spheres. And within the US, for example, we've seen that Muslim women who are in office experience unique forms of violence against them. So whether we look at how Ilhan Omar is treated or Rashida Tlaib is treated, there's a way that they're Muslim, being Muslim women, that they're targeted in that way. And so it is the state utilizing gendered forms of violence to oppress, monitor, punish, maim, and control Muslim bodies. And so this is a definition that we pulled out of a much more larger, longer, in-depth definition, which you can definitely read in our Gendered Islamophobia report that we had launched. So next slide, please. So one of the ways at JMC that we really look at Islamophobia is, for us, we really break it down into these 4 sort of levels of how Islamophobia operates. And I want to say, obviously, that this gendered Islamophobia work is also built upon the work that we do around Islamophobia. For us, you know, gendered Islamophobia exists at the structural level. So when we say structures, we're talking about institutions from the state. We're talking about hundreds of years of how government agencies, state agencies have been operating for a while. And through that interaction between multiple institutions, you start seeing that the quality of life for Muslim women is much more worse. So I know, for example, that there are reports that come out of Europe that have talked about how gendered Islamophobia for Muslim women has created issues around economic access, around jobs, around physical health, around an increase in hate violence. We're also seeing the ways in which criminalization of Muslim women is occurring, not only in the United States, but also within Europe as well. Then we have institutionalized forms of Islamophobia, gendered Islamophobia that exist. So this is the ways in which, for example, Department of Homeland Security did an entire training of folks who are officers at airports. And in that training, they had explicit material that looked at Muslim women as threats around terrorism. So they were like, any Muslim woman, if you see her acting, if she's nervous or whatever, that this is a result of, watch out for her and profile her. So when we talk about institutionalized forms of gendered Islamophobia, it is ways in which particularly institutions have material, have training, and are operationalizing in policy discrimination against Muslim women. And that could be explicit or it could be implicit forms. The third level we have is the interpersonal forms of gendered Islamophobia. I will say that this is where a lot of attention has been given more recently within Muslim communities to Muslim women, which is the fact that the majority of victims of hate violence tend to be Muslim women. And so when we talk about interpersonal forms of gendered Islamophobia, we're speaking about the rise of hate crimes. We're talking about the physical as well as emotional, verbal, psychological violence that Muslim women experience in the workplace, the comments, the microaggressions, which, I feel like microaggressions is sometimes a misnomer because we think it's minimal violence, but it's not. It's actually operating within a place of saying you don't belong here, you're not accepted, you can't be who you are and actually show up in this space. So that's sort of the third layer of gendered Islamophobia that we look at. The final one is internalized forms of gendered Islamophobia. And so here, what we are really looking at is the ways in which, as a community, as Muslim women, as Muslim communities, we are internalizing the negative dominant messaging of the state against us. So this could look like being like, well, if a Muslim woman is more religious, then she is oppressed. She is not as free. Or, being a Western Muslim woman means somehow you are more civilized versus our Muslim sisters who are fighting in the global South. So it's the ways in which we end up internalizing not only negative messaging, but become sort of pawns within state policy or institutional policies against other Muslim women and Muslim communities overall. So that's a real sort of broad framework of the different layers of gendered Islamophobia and how we see them. Next slide, y'all. So this is a real sort of a pyramid that we created to talk about what are the different layers of violence and where gendered Islamophobia really exists. And so for us, we really feel it's important to say that at the top of the pyramid, meaning where violence is really mainly emanating from, those negative social constructions, the policies, the dehumanization, is at the state level. So it's government policies, it's institutions, it's the codification within law, it's the codification within government programs. So I I know, for example, the work of like Seher and others who are doing work around particularly CVE and surveillance. We know there have been policies where USAID has said for women in Afghanistan that if you don't do work around surveillance, or let's do anti-surveillance CVE program with pregnant mothers. I mean, these are explicit policies by the state that are pushing this. The second layer that we look at is broader social society. So this is where the media plays a role. If I was to just present a screen to you about imagery, if you just put in Muslim women and see the imagery that you will end up finding on Google, so much of it is so dehumanizing, degrading, totally does not respect the agency of Muslim women, but also it is not imagery that is coming from Muslim women on the broad ways that Muslim women are and Muslim communities are. It's really from the state to push a certain kind of an agenda when it comes to Muslim communities. The third layer that we talk about is at the community level. And so this is not only Muslim community, but also the broader community you're in. So how is it that patriarchy, gender-based violence, then intersect with gendered Islamophobia to create conditions for Muslim women and girls that are incredibly hard and difficult. So from hate violence to things like gender-based violence of DV, sexual assault, harassment. And then there's the family level. So again, we're bringing in that analysis of patriarchy. We know that in patriarchy, violence towards women or gender-based violence also occurs at that family level. And then we talk about particularly also within intimate relationships, within familiar relationships, and the internalized forms. And so just to be, if we took a step back and thought about just how many ways gendered Islamophobia and violence operates, you will see that particularly within this pyramid, we try to encompass the ways in which they're all interacting with one another as well. So next slide. So this is sort of a spectrum that we created to kind of get a better understanding of how harmful narratives, harmful perceptions on Muslim communities and Muslim women in particular, then end up creating the spectrum of violence that on its worst end is about war, genocide, murder, and killings. But that if we only focus on, for example, the fact that women tend to be marginalized and targeted when we talk about wars, drones, when we talk about sanctions, I mean, who is that harming? That is harming women in a very particular way. Or when we hear these brutal stories of hate crimes and murder and sexual assaults that are happening against Muslim women, or the incarceration or the criminalization, that violence doesn't start out at that sort of end of the spectrum. It actually starts out much more earlier on, and that is in those negative perceptions of Muslim women. It is in the kind of narrative you see in mainstream media, which constantly, if you just look at the ways Muslim women are depicted in the media, it's always, we have no agency, we're in need of saving, we're oppressed, there's always some tyrannical man in our life that we need to be saved from. And to really be critical of those perceptions as well as those narratives, because those narratives end up subconsciously and also very explicitly shaping how you view and perceive our community members. And that has real life consequences when it comes to not only enabling violence, but also for being complicit and not saying something when you see these forms of violences happen. So again, definitely would love to push this particular spectrum, and really would also say use this as a tool within your agency or within the work that you're doing to see some concrete examples of where at the end spectrum of war, violence, murder, incarceration, death, think about also what is the spectrum pre that actually creates the environment to build that kind of violence out. Cool, next slide. And then finally, this is something that we also built as a tool, is to really think about how to map out gendered Islamophobia as it pertains to different fields. Now, for us, we had done it within 3 sort of fields. One was the Academy on Gendered Islamophobia. Another was the reproductive justice, which Seher will get into in a minute. And the third was the War on Terror piece in GBV. And I just want to very quickly talk about some of those intersections for survivors of violence and how the War on Terror plays out. One is, for any of us who work with communities of color, women of color, we know that the state's criminal criminalization apparatus plays a role when it comes to responding to survivors. So for many Muslim survivors, there's always a fear and concern of, if I come forward and report, is this going to also somehow warrant some kind of surveillance against my community? Or is this going to be used to, target members of my community? Or is it going to push on further Islamophobia, which we know that often a lot of right-wing white supremacists will push really anti-immigrant policies, anti-Muslim policies by specifically weaponizing the experiences of Muslim women with gender-based violence in the community. And I think that for us, those of us who really care to be there for survivors of all communities, it's really important that we don't put this burden on survivors to have to choose between their community and their safety. And that we should be very, very mindful that we want to center survivors in a way that does not also cause them harm and push them away. And so again, a lot of those unconscious, subconscious biases do play a role here. The other just very quick example that I want to share about is Noor Salman. Noor Salman is someone who was a survivor of domestic violence and sexual assault at the hands of Omar Mateen. Omar Mateen was unfortunately the individual who was responsible for the Pulse massacre that occurred. And we've seen with also other women as well that the state will try to criminalize survivors and hold them responsible for the violence of men. And so in this instance, Noor Salman was charged with supporting terrorism, particularly the violence that Omar Mateen had carried out. And so again, this was a very clear example of where a Muslim survivor of violence, rather than receiving solidarity and support, the state actually used that to further criminalize her, take her away from her children, and also throw her in federal prison where she was being held. Of course, in the end, thank God, her charges were all dismissed, but she still spent over a year in prison, in federal prison, on charges, and was separated with her family and was deeply traumatized as a result of it. So I'll just pause there and actually, obviously we have the report. Please definitely do take a look at it. And also I did go over time, so I apologize, Seher, but I wanted to pass it on to Seher, who will be talking about GBV and GI and reproductive justice. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Daraksha. That was so great, so comprehensive. Yeah, we highly encourage folks to, if you want to do a deeper dive into everything that we're sharing, download the report, and you can spend hours just looking at our beautiful graphics in this report. But so if we go to this next slide, which talks about how gendered Islamophobia shows up in our fields, and so the way that we did this is we had a convening on actually September 11th of last year. And we invited folks from different spaces who were advocates with regards to survivors of intimate partner violence or sexual assault. We had folks who were academics, folks who were in organizing spaces. So it was kind of like a range of folks who came together. There was about 25 or 30 of us. We split up into 3 groups, and one of the groups focused on reproductive justice and gender-based violence. I'm really just thinking about, and it was a lot of folks who were, again, like service providers, academics, organizers, who were thinking about how is this showing up in our fields? Because we had done a survey before people got there, and we asked them, do you experience yourself gender-based violence as you're doing your job? And every single person that submitted a survey said yes, that they experience it personally as they're navigating their job. And then they're also seeing it show up in the ways that they're carrying out their jobs. And so we wanted to kind of point to, so we did this like brainstorm activity where we took the different structures of structural, institutional, interpersonal, and internalized, and had folks just lay it all out. Like, what is it that you're seeing and how it shows up? So I wanted to share some of the findings here that I felt would be relevant for you all at API-GBV. And so we know that, when we're talking about reproductive justice, this is the right to have families, to not have families, to make sure those families are safe and secure and resourced, right? And the right to bodily autonomy. So integrated into reproductive justice is this real idea of living in safety, free of surveillance, free from state violence, free from interpersonal violence, and also having bodily autonomy, right? Which is a big part of having ownership over your body that doesn't require interference from the state. So a lot of what you'll see on this map demonstrates how the lived experience of folks who are Muslim that's not, we have a lot of work to do when it comes to reaching reproductive justice for Muslim folks. So you'll see here, you have specific legislation that's still being implemented with regards to reproductive rights, right? So abortion access, around global gag rule. You have stuff around rape, so sexual assaults being used as a war tactic against folks in Muslim populations globally. So this is also, we tend to have a focus always on US-based politics and what's happening in the US, but we want us to also think about, when it comes to gendered Islamophobia in particular, US empire, right? So where has the United States gone and involved themselves in wars, or under the banner of fighting the war on terror, disrupted the lives of Muslim folks who are also living outside of the United States, and how that also impacts us here in the United States. So we're thinking about, again, rape, we're thinking about forced sterilizations, and obviously there was the article that broke around forced hysterectomies, right? And we know that there are Muslim migrants who are also kept in detention centers who were impacted by that. When we're thinking about medical experimentation of gendered different bodies, we're also looking at, and this is something that I think is really particular to the gender-based violence field, but funding that comes from the federal government for Muslim-specific populations always presents the gender-based violence in these extreme forms, right? So they'll call them honor killings instead of domestic violence, right? They'll talk about, acid attacks or female genital mutilation or cutting, and yet these things are specific to Muslim communities. And so we need to provide funding to address these forms of gender-based violence. So one is kind of exotifying or making these forms of gender-based violence as extreme, creating a hierarchy of victimhood, but then also ignoring the fact that there's a lot of folks in our communities who are experiencing violence just with regards to domestic violence, interpersonal violence, sexual assault, and those things get overlooked, right? So the resources are only if it fits the narrative and the context that allows for the war on terror to also continue, right? Being like, look at these barbaric Muslims and all of that they're doing with regards to these gendered forms of violence. We have to stop them. And we're going to give folks money who are addressing these specific forms. There's also, and this is a lot of work that NAPOF, for folks who are familiar with that organization, they've worked around sex selective abortion regulation. So saying specifically for Asian communities that they have a preference for males. And so we should actually ban abortions of all sorts because we're afraid that they're gonna be doing, engaging in sex selective abortions so that they have more males or females, right? So, and these are all things that are not based on research. They're not it's literally coming from their stereotypes of our communities. Yeah, exactly, right, Habiba? There's a comment here around calling it honor-based killings than simply murder. I don't think it's, okay, so there's a difference, right? Because when you think about intimate partner violence, when you think about domestic violence, it's still centered around power and control and someone's ego being hurt, right? So it's still going back to somebody's honor or ego not being stroked in the way that upsets them to the point that they're acting out of violence, right? So when you're labeling honor killings specific only to Muslim communities or brown communities, you're making it seem as if that's not a factor in other cases of intimate partner violence or domestic violence, right? So there's also a lack of analysis in how we're talking about intimate partner violence and domestic violence to begin with then. Okay, then, and I'll move on because I know we wanna ask you all as well, where do you see this showing up in your own fields? But the last thing I wanna talk about is when it comes to interpersonally, right? So when we're talking about within Muslim community spaces, there's also a silencing that happens of survivors in community spaces because there's a fear that if we talk about these things, we're going to feed Islamophobic narratives. So the needs of the survivors, the avenues and the pathways for justice for survivors become they get put on the back burner out of fear that the community or maybe families have around promoting Islamophobic narratives. And this is something that, you know, I'm sure a lot of you have been working with Muslim survivors, know that there are multiple barriers to reporting for Muslim survivors. And Hart has done quite extensive research on this as well, of just kind of mapping out what those barriers are. And we've experienced it as well working in Muslim communities where people are really afraid of promoting Islamophobic narratives, whether it's that they're going to the police or they're going to the domestic violence shelter or they're going to seek resources and services from their community. They don't want that they show up at the door and they're going to be confronted with those Islamophobic, gendered Islamophobic stereotypes of, well, this is what you can expect, blah, blah, blah. And we've seen this happen, right? So this is just something we want to be really, really clear about, that this is an actual barrier that's preventing survivors from coming forward to seek help. And so it is incumbent upon all of us to actually take down the structural, the systems that are allowing these barriers to continue to exist, right? Because these barriers are also not founded. These aren't just things that survivors are thinking of, they're things that they've experienced and they've heard from others in the community. And so I'll pause there. And then I think, Yazan, are you explaining the breakout, or not the breakout room, but the activity next, or am I?
I can do it. I can take a stab. So we have some questions that we wanted to be able to map out with you all, and to get your feedback to start being able to sort of understand, how does gendered Islamophobia show up in my own work? And this can be whether or not you're aware of it, maybe rethinking experiences you've had, and also maybe reflecting on either the work you've done or the work your agency has done in perpetuating gendered Islamophobia. Of course, whether or not that's known or not. So what we have is, we have a Jamboard that we're going to share the link to so people can share their answers on the Jamboard. I'm not sure, I have the link here. The only part I need support in is just breaking down the different layers. Oh, perfect. Thank you, Sahir. Of the responses. But basically each section represents a different subfield relating to gender-based violence. And so if you join us on the Jamboard and you start on the second slide, there's the conversation around gender-based violence and war on terror. There is another slide that's looking at gender justice. And so this can relate to issues around feminism or issues around LGBTQ rights. And then last but not least, you can look at the relationship between reproductive justice and gendered Islamophobia. Okay, and then I also, perfect, thank you, Sada. We also have support here, like between us, if anyone has any questions on clarifying more, like, I don't necessarily know examples of gendered Islamophobia and the war on terror, or gendered Islamophobia and gender justice, gendered Islamophobia and reproductive justice. We're more than happy to also talk through that more. We just wanted to give folks an opportunity to share their thoughts, share their feedback, and answer these questions. And I will copy paste the questions here in the chat as well. But these are the questions we're inviting people to reflect on while they fill out this Jamboard. And if anyone has questions, again, please go ahead and ask. We're more than happy to help how we can. But the questions are, how has gendered Islamophobia shown up in your work? And then think about your agency or personal complicity in perpetuating gendered Islamophobia and the steps you'll take to disrupt it now that you know the harm that it causes. And this is a free-for-all. We'll give folks, what do you all want to say? 5 minutes, 7? Okay.
Let's do 7.
We'll give you all, okay, cool. Sounds good.
I also realized this might be the first time folks are using a Jamboard. And so as a quick tutorial, you'll see on the shared screen that there's a toolbar to the left. And if you go down to the fourth icon, it looks like a little Post-it. And if you click on that, that'll pop up like a little, it'll pop up a Post-it. And so you can type on that and then save it and then move it around on the screen. So that's one way to add your suggestions. The next one is if you go down to the second to the last icon, which is the one that has the little T, that'll show up as a text box. And so you can type your suggestions or, your responses there. And then you can put it on the board. So there's also, you could scroll through, right? So there's 3 different Jamboards that we're working on. So the first one, again, gender-based violence and war on terror. The third one is gender justice. And the fourth one is reproductive justice. And if you feel like these could go on all of them, feel free to add them to all. So copy and paste away. So if you have any additional questions or need technical support around using the Jamboard, or if you're just like, I don't want to deal with this, feel free to drop it in the chat box and one of us can also put it into the Jamboard for you.
Yeah, I just want to uplift. If if folks are struggling with the Jamboard, we are more than happy to copy paste comments onto it for you. Or if you just even want to chat here, we will still uplift the chats here as well. The reason that we like to do Jamboard is just to try to organize thoughts in relation to a specific theme. And it also becomes a resource that you all can look back at and we can look back at for future conversations. It's really important to hear from folks working in these different fields about specific experiences or examples they have, because this is how we start to begin to document these kinds of phenomena and support in developing strategies to fight back against them. Cool. So we'll give folks about another minute or two. Okay. So just scanning over the different responses, and I want to invite folks to do the same if you've had a chance already. But a lot of these are really filling up. And I really appreciate everyone's honesty. I think based on the feedback, it seems like there are some people who are sharing either from their own experiences or experiences of loved ones around them. And I think that anything relating to gender-based violence is always very dense and very heavy. So just thank you again, Seher, for leading us through a grounding at the beginning. I think sometimes when we get in these conversations, especially teach-ins like this, there's so much intensity with explaining concepts that the weight of the subject also sometimes kind of just goes through our heads and then randomly surfaces. So wanting to hold space for the weight and intensity of the topic itself. But from what I'm seeing, there is a lot of relationships between the three about the monolith of Muslim women. So a lot of different people are raising points about how there is a really basic and stereotypical understanding of Muslim women and that how that is creating a source of tension. And so, for example, in gender justice, there are issues for people accessing safety because there's a promotion of the idea that all Muslim women are the same. And it changes how Muslim women will be able to access resources relating to gender justice issues, right? Or for reproductive justice, there are people who are put in positions of having to choose between actually speaking out about their own experiences or putting their entire community on blast because of the stereotypical understandings of Islam, right? So what ends up happening is Muslim women who are survivors end up being put in this position where accessing their own safety becomes at the expense of their community because of how policies are structured, right? And I think another point that's really important to uplift is someone here naming in the medical field that their own cultural and religious needs get disregarded, right? So their specific accommodations that they're asking for become read as bizarre, which is a very Islamophobic interaction to have, right? There are different accommodations that people need, and by not being able to normalize those accommodations, it puts Muslim people, Muslim women, Muslim non-binary folks in the position of having to ask for an accommodation that should be culturally understood, right? So the lack of cultural sensitivity and the lack of, familiarity with differences from different people and racial and ethnic backgrounds makes it harder and harder for people to access resources, right? So this is a systemic example, right? The systems that are in place have a particular culture that they are catering to, and it creates a traumatizing experience for other people to access these resources. So even if they're trying to go through the steps of accessing things that are reaffirming of their gender, reaffirming of their health, that are supposed to be supportive of their safety, it actually antagonizes and isolates and alienates folks, right? So I'm really thankful that folks are being able to name these things and flesh them out. Let's see. Right, okay. So in this example here that Maria sent to the chat, looking at how there is already a perception that people have to fight up against, right? So thinking of the emotional and physical labor that this mother has to do to counteract how she is already perceived without even actually interacting with anyone, right? And what that means, right? How that reflects racism and Islamophobia and xenophobia, right? And the people that are holding these perceptions. Also want to uplift that there are people, and yeah, if we want to move the pages around, I was just kind of, sorry, I was reading back and forth between different ones. But looking at the war on terror, I started with the other one, so I apologize for that. I know that the ones that are on the screen, but there are also folks who are naming the savior complex. So this again is this notion of folks who identify as Muslim women or Muslim LGBTQ folks, what ends up happening is people getting saved from their families, right? Or these kinds of narratives. It actually alienates and isolates people from their own families, right? And this is a very clear, I want to name, military tactic that the United States uses time and time again. If you've ever read strategy handbooks from the Department of Homeland Security or from US military personnel, they emphasize the importance in isolating Muslim women for the rest of their community as an entry point into breaking community apart. And so the reason that I'm naming that in response to this comment is there is a lot more gendered violence and violence in general that's created from these kinds of interactions, right? But they're called saving. They're perceived as something that's generous or benevolent, but it actually results in a lot of gendered violence and gendered harm for Muslim men, Muslim women, and LGBTQ Muslim folks. And I think someone up here also uplifting, instead of directly communicating with specific survivors, talking to someone's imam, right? So not having the understanding of Islam enough, or like really, I think Seher, you were responding dehumanization in general. I know for a different comment, but this is also very dehumanizing, right? Not respecting the agency and autonomy of an individual, and also checking yourself and being like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. I will go directly to this person, and instead I will go to a religious authority figure to try to clarify things, right? So creating more tensions within a community because of our lack of cultural competency. That's a really important thing to uplift. Let's see, if folks want to flip through into the next pages. And I just want to uplift Seher's comment about this being really heartbreaking to read, right? This is really, really heavy. Let's see. Yeah, and it's not an obvious question at all. I'm not sure if other folks can read this question, but a starting point on military policy and the relationship to gender. We have a few resources. Direction, I don't know if there's one that, or actually in our policy agenda, I think also touches on these points, which Seher is going to go over, which actually reminds me we should probably move into that. Sorry. But it's not an obvious question. And I would also look up countering violent extremism. I can send a report once Seher's talking that looks at the role of women specifically in gender, but these are some of the examples. But another really classic example I will name is the war in Afghanistan. The war in Afghanistan is a very, very popular understanding of saving Muslim women from Muslim men that actually is at the expense of land and resources and women, right? But anyway, thank you very much, everyone, for engaging us in this and sharing these things. If you guys want to keep the link to keep referring back to these examples, I think it's very illuminating and very important to center these narratives, because these are the things that we usually don't get to hear. These are the things that come out, that fall through the cracks, and that's how these things get perpetuated. So want to thank folks. And I also want to name, if anyone puts something on there that they're like, I don't want this to be like held in the Jamboard after we sign off today, you can feel free to remove it if that's something that you feel like you need to do. This is anonymous. We don't know who put what. And this is something that we would generally refer back to as a group, but we won't actually directly quote anyone without consent or anything. So this is not something that's going to be shared out. I just also want to clarify that. If anything, examples would be generally referenced to help illustrate points. But go ahead and pass it to Seher.
All right, so wow, I'm still reeling from the stuff that folks were sharing on the Jamboard, acknowledging that a lot of us have been impacted directly as well, right? Like, it doesn't leave you after you've experienced gendered Islamophobia or seen it happen to someone you're trying to serve, like directly. And so just wanted to acknowledge that and hope that this is also the start of just like building community where we can actually heal from these experiences through our resistance to gendered Islamophobia. And so Nadia, if you go back to the PowerPoint, I wanted to just quickly share a bit about some of the recommendations that we're making with regards to how do we address this. And they're not exactly like policy recommendations. It's like, I would say it's bigger than that. And so we really want to start with the first one is how do we move the Office on Violence Against Women, right? So a little bit of a history lesson is that the Office on Violence Against Women was created out of the Violence Against Women Act, and this was 1994, and it was placed as a department in an office under the Department of Justice, so DOJ, right? The Department of Justice has a lot of other agencies and departments that fall under it, including the FBI, Federal Bureau of Investigation, including community-oriented policing services, COPS. And all of these are, yeah, we could see it, thanks Nadia. So all of these departments have participated in the war on terror actively, right? Like they have surveilled, profiled, entrapped, incarcerated folks in Muslim and Muslim adjacent communities. Because we also know, we have to be clear about this, that the war on terror doesn't just impact Muslims, right? It's anyone who could be perceived as Muslims, and the tools that are created in the national security apparatus are also used against Black people and brown folks, regardless of their religious affiliation, right? It's used in to incarcerate folks and to deport folks and to label them in certain ways. And all of those are racialized and also gendered. So we know from lived experience that the FBI has infiltrated multiple Muslim communities across the nation and participated in some really harmful practices of also you know, informancy to the point where like nobody in the community knows that they're working for the FBI. They like start relationships with women in the community. Those women are consenting to like sexual relations or romantic relationships with these individuals, but they don't know that they're FBI agents, right? So it's also state-sanctioned gender-based violence in that regard, because you're not getting informed consent. This person doesn't actually know who they are intimately involved with. So these agencies that have actively participated in gender-based harm, state-sanctioned gender-based harm that is intersecting with Islamophobia, fall under the same department that's housing Office on Violence Against Women, where survivors are supposed to get resources and services from. And just anecdotally, I'll share that, like, you know, HEART has received funding from OVW, and we have come up against this in our own community, of wanting to do programs and provide services, or, you know, like just do educational workshops with folks in Muslim communities. And you know how you have to put that disclaimer whenever you get a federal grant on your, all over your materials, all over your slides and stuff. Folks see that and they get frightened, rightfully so, right? They're like, oh my God, you're taking money from DOJ. Well, how, you know, is my name going to be tracked? Is this information going back to the community? Like, there's this instant panic of what is it that you're doing as a Muslim agency working with DOJ, right? And even if I give them the history that OVW is coming out of survivor advocacy, and it's so that we can get more funding and have a structure to support survivors, the fact remains, this is still under DOJ. And so our push is really to think about who are we missing the note on with regards to creating additional barriers to access by keeping OVW under DOJ. What message are we sending to larger communities who have been impacted violently from DOJ's other departments, or DOJ in general? And how can we think more creatively around how to shift this, right? We're also seeing calls from larger communities who have been brutalized and criminalized by the state for, you know, let's be real, centuries, that we want to reduce also the criminalization aspect, right? OVW being under DOJ, it's focused on getting the crime named, right? So that you can get that, that charge through, you can get the services, and we want to also think about more creatively, how can we shift from criminalization to community-based, kind of community-driven transformative justice mechanisms to address sexual violence, to address gender-based violence. And I'm reading something in the chat that I do want to first share. So OVW is the state, right? So we did client focus groups to see how accessible our services were for an OVW grant, and found that majority of survivors found their interactions with law enforcement to be negative. OVW told our agency that we could not include it in the report, right? And so there's also, and I'm sure many of us have experienced this as well, we have to tiptoe around how we talk about these issues out of fear for losing funding for critical life-saving services to survivors, out of upsetting the folks up there in DOJ, right? So, and it's because OVW is accountable to DOJ. So if we somehow can maneuver it so that we move OVW out of DOJ into a different department, maybe the Department of Health and Human Services or something, that could be really great. And you can see like the other departments that are housed in HHS is they're service oriented, they're family oriented, they're community oriented. I'm not saying they're perfect, but hey, we got to start somewhere. And if you go to the next slide, and this kind of goes back to, look, a lot of survivors don't actually want to go through the criminal justice system. It is not the ideal system to seek justice because, one, how many people actually get the charge that they're looking for to be like validated by the state? But two, there's a lot of ways that within the criminal justice system, they experience violence again, right? Because the system itself takes power and control away from survivors. From the moment that they report to law enforcement to, you know, they're not in control anymore with regards to, okay, if the city attorney or district attorney wants to take the case on, and then, you know, it all depends on whether or not the state can make the case that this person broke a law, right? So it's really, it can sometimes create further harm to survivors. And we know this based on our experiences working with survivors, that they also have to relive their trauma, right? It's not survivor-centered and trauma-informed in the way that they have to navigate the court system. There's also, again, so there's this like focus on law and criminalization and not necessarily healing for the survivor, right? So taking into account, like, what does the survivor actually want from this process? What do they want to see in order to heal from the experiences that they've had? There's also a resource drain, right? You know, like sometimes the survivor has to take time off to like go to the courts or like go back to the police. There's also a resource drain with regards to kind of just the court trying to get this criminal charge, and then the person, if they're incarcerated, like what happens after that for the survivor, right? It's not necessarily that resources are going back to the survivor to help them recreate their life. It's more about getting the charge for the person that has harmed. And again, it's about a temporary solution with no guarantee of change behavior. So a person can also be criminalized, go to jail, and come out, and their behavior might not have changed. So it's not also, it's like really a Band-Aid solution to what we know is we have to do structural, kind of interpersonal, communal shifts so that we have a culture shift to address gender-based violence. Holding space for survivors who don't want to criminalize their abuser, but instead want to heal another way. Right. So there's like currently, what are the options for survivors if they don't want to go the criminal route? Very far and few in between that are resourced by the state. And so, you know, and we also know that inherently in the criminal justice system, there are higher rates of criminalization for Black and Brown individuals. And then also you have the added complication that there's multiple systems of criminalization that are working against folks who hold those identities. So clear example, Muslim survivor of Somali descent, comes and is nervous about filing a police report because they're worried that the law enforcement officers that are in her neighborhood are going to additionally tack on terrorist charges to the person that harmed her, right? And this is actually not far-fetched because the law enforcement agencies want to show that they're doing their job, and they're doing their job sometimes means that they take the person that's in front of them, and because they match a profile of who could be a terrorist, right, they'll tack on those charges because it's an easy win for them to say they're doing their job, right? So it's a vicious cycle of like, they need to keep their jobs, so they're trying to see who they can criminalize, and sometimes it's the easy target that's in front of them. So we have to be thinking about these nuanced ways that the state is working against survivors. And we also have to think about how do we address this as a community who wants to see an end to gender-based violence, right? So that takes a step in advocating for like structural changes to the ways that survivors are supported through these agencies, and the actual, I mean, we can get into whether this is a stereotype or not about law enforcement, but our lived reality is that this has happened. And even if it's one law enforcement agency, that means that there's something structurally that's allowing them to do that, right? So, and just as someone who is also abolitionist, I don't think that I want to promote criminalization because I don't think it's an effective means to end gender-based violence. So like with that regard, we also have to be thinking about how are alternatives to law enforcement being resourced, and how can we do that as a community that's invested in our healing. So I'll stop there and would love to maybe move into just a reflection for the last few minutes. And I know I talked a lot about all the things, so if anyone has questions, come at me. And Dharaksha, I don't know if we're also facilitating a like share back of like what's one thing you're taking away.
Yeah, definitely. No, we are, but I wanted to make some room for reflection first. Folks, we know we shared a lot of very heavy and dense content, so definitely bear with us, but also please use the chat for any thoughts or even any questions. Again, we started out by talking about the definition of gendered Islamophobia, the ways in which negative perceptions of Muslim communities, of Muslim and Islam and gender, Muslim women shapes behaviors and policies and attitudes, and also talked about the different ways, layers of gendered Islamophobia and how it shows up from the structural level, which is the state institutions, which law enforcement, prisons, jails, all are part of that, the military. Even if there might be individuals in there that are good, the system and structure, however, was not built to at all work on behalf of our communities. It has a really racist, violent past, and it's operating in that way to this moment. Also talking about at interpersonal levels of how it operates. And then we got into the mapping portion of it, where y'all did a great point in terms of just the, sharing the different ways that it manifests, and want to pull out, again, some of the themes that Yazan was sharing, but many of you also shared how within your agencies, you've seen negative perceptions and attitudes against Muslims, immigrant communities show up. You've talked about how Muslim staff have been treated, how Muslim service providers are not necessarily seen as trustable. Someone also mentioned that when there's anything around halal food for survivors, that sometimes the attitude from agencies is stop trying to get special attention, or this is special. So there's also the flip side of treating Muslim communities as if we're asking for something unique, rather than, looking at agency practices around it. So yeah, would love to hear other kind of reflections. Please feel free to put it within the chat. And then of course, Seher spoke a little bit about some concrete policy suggestions of what we could do around, particularly service provision, and where the source of funding and where it's structured within the government agency. So we know we threw a lot at you. And of course, we're sharing our report and everything. But yeah, would love to hear any questions that you have, maybe for the next 2 minutes, and then we'll start wrapping up and getting into a closing. Awesome. Oh, wow. Change your entire dissertation. Wow. Yes. Great. Perfect. I don't know, Yazan or Seher, if you have any other reflections before we go into a closing.
I just have to say I'm really excited that we had over like 120 people at one point, and also just excited to see so many like Muslim adjacent folks on here. I think it's hard to build community in these spaces, especially if we're working in silos. And so, and folks who are values aligned, because I'm just really grateful for API-GBV like hosting us for this. And I know that, what we said, some of it might go over your head, and that's okay. We invite you to like kind of sit with it, right? Because it's really heavy, and continue to look back in the reports. Mm-hmm. And we have a question: what actions should allies take to help end gendered Islamophobia, especially in regards to domestic violence? I mean, if you're working in a domestic violence agency, I think first starting with an assessment of your organization and your agency as to what communities are you leaving out in terms of your outreach, in terms of your services, in terms of your accessibility with regards to languages. What's the representation on your staff also? So if you're also in an agency serving a space or a city where there are, like a lot of Muslims, but you don't actually have any Muslim identified folks in your staff or in your outreach team, like don't be alarmed if like you're a white woman and you show up at like a Muslim space and they're skeptical of you, right? And they're like worried about trusting you. That's again like a very valid thing, that Muslim folks have been entrapped by folks who are white identified. And so it's a part of it is relationship building, right? So how are you really building trust with those that you're trying to serve? How are you taking an analysis of your own organization and stereotypes that might be perpetuated at a structural or organizational level? And how are you thinking about alternatives and barriers, right? So if you know that perhaps the Muslim communities in your area are hesitant to trust law enforcement, what are actively alternatives that you can present them? And if you don't have those, how are you working with other organizations to build that out? So there's multiple layers of what you can be doing, but also checking your implicit biases yourself is a great way to start, right? So just thinking about like, wow, what stereotypes am I personally holding that I need to work through that might show up if I'm serving Muslim survivors? So yeah, so hope that helps in terms of answering that question. But honestly, being here is the first start, right? Like you're here, you're learning, you're building relationships with us as organizations. That's a great first start.
I think everything that Sahar said is perfect. I just also wanted to add, if it's okay to use that anecdote that we use in one of our case vignettes so at Vigilant Love, we have a campaign called Service is Not Surveillance, which looks, someone a while ago had flagged what is the relationship between gendered Islamophobia and mental health services. And one of the case studies that we read, which is in a report that I'll share before we close out so you all have access to the PDF, looks at the experiences of different Muslims trying to access mental health services. And one of the folks that we read about was a Muslim woman who originally started therapy because she was a survivor of GBV. And at the time, she had not yet converted to Islam, right, Sahar? So she was someone who had not yet converted and was seeking counseling for her experiences with GBV. And that was why she was going to therapy, was trying to seek healing for her trauma that she experienced. And she safely fled that relationship. And during the course of her treatment had started a new relationship. And in that relationship, she was dating someone who was Muslim. Of her own accord, she converted to Islam. And throughout the experience that she had with her therapist started to hone in on, you are being pressured into converting to Islam. You are someone who is becoming culturally backwards. You are learning things. You are being controlled by your partner. And so even though she came from this vantage point of having experienced physical and psychological abuse from someone who was not Muslim and was seeking therapy for that, her therapist started to hone in on her new partner and thought her new partner was unsafe and started switching her therapy to focus on that. And so this person stopped coming to therapy because they're like, you are presuming what my experience is. You are not affirming what I am telling you is my experience, and you're not helping with my actual trauma. And so I think everything that Sahar mapped out, that's kind of an anecdote that I think really holds in on like manifesting those kinds of tensions. This therapist was not checking their implicit bias. This therapist was clinging to what are mainstream stereotypes about Islam. And this person was dehumanizing the person in front of them. Instead of listening to the voice of this person and trusting them to be autonomous in communicating their needs and their experience, this person instead was projecting, I know your culture and your community better. And what also that leads into is this person who was seeking therapy is someone who was like, I want to travel abroad to learn Arabic. And so it started to lead into an issue of national security, where this person was like, do I need to report this patient as a potential threat of extremism, right? So really looking at how this person who came from a background that was not originally someone who's going to be racialized Muslim-ish is slowly starting to experience all of the dangers that Seher is referencing. They're not being taken seriously. The experiences with violence are being dismissed. Their current life is being called into question. And now they are potentially going to be criminalized for their cultural and religious practice. And so these kinds of things are all of the things that are constantly going through the heads of Muslim survivors, in addition to what other folks named in the Jamboard. So just wanting to name that the kind of space that needs to be held, like Seher said, is really patient, really nuanced, and is also still taking direction from your patient, which is something that I think most providers, most therapists are taught to do. But sometimes when we think of structural racism, naturally fades away, right? This is the moment where the isms start to control the situation instead of the commitment to care, the commitment to support.
Yeah, no, awesome. Thank you, Seher and Yazan. I think picking back on what everything both of them said is, I really think for agency level, do you have a working understanding of what racism is and how all the ways that violence operates for particularly survivors? Because I think gendered Islamophobia should not be seen in a vacuum, but rather, again, how communities of color are impacted and survivors, Black and brown survivors who are approaching you all, how are they being impacted? And within that, understanding how specifically Islamophobia operates. So I'm a big one in terms of like, have those conversations at the agency level, institutionalize them through policies. You know, often when I look at agency policies, like, is there anything about gendered Islamophobia in there? Name anti-Black racism, right? Like name these things, because if you don't, then they're not going to get acknowledged, and you leave the burden on survivors or individuals within the agency, particularly those on the front lines who also happen to be Black and brown often, who then have to live with the weight of not having the agency support, an agency culture that's white supremacist, but while having to meet the needs of the community, which is why a lot of frontline workers get so burnt out and leave this field in totality. So really thinking about our institutions and our agencies, like, we are living in the milieu of all of this violence and it shows up there. And so having that, doing that work is really important. I also just want to give a minute to all of us to just respond to this other question about, particularly from Muslim folks who are navigating gendered Islamophobia. I mean, my one thing is that I pray that we can do the work so that the burden does not fall on us to have to navigate and deal with the violence, because that is so difficult. So inshallah, we can do the work to move institutions and move others. But then I think for yourself, I think finding community, for me, community has been the most important thing. And so, yeah, we invite any of you all to join our Gendered Islamophobia coalition and the work that we do. So we're happy to be a community for you as well. But yeah, for me, community has been a huge support. I don't know, Seher, Yazan, if you want to add anything.
I just want to say that I love working with Yazan and Daraksha because we get to talk about this day in and day out, and it's so therapeutic and healing. There was a question that we received of what advice or words of encouragement do you have for Muslim women and LGBTQ+ folks dealing with gendered Islamophobia in the workplace? I think community goes a long way, even if you can find one ally in your workspace who you can process with or share these concerns with. It sometimes just starts from acknowledgement, right? So, and if you can't find that, just know that you're not making it up in your head, right? Oftentimes we like to minimize the voice of whatever kind of harm we're experiencing as if it's not a big deal, and as if there's no way that they can change, right? They should be changing, and you're not making it into something that it's not, right? So, yeah, just want to affirm you. I think we're here if you ever want to connect with us and share about your experiences, to brainstorm how you can address it. I think this could also be a really cool project for if there's a larger organization to take on, of thinking about how do we do an assessment, right, of our organizations, of our DV agencies, GBV agencies, and how we can think about if we are perpetuating gendered Islamophobia, create safe spaces for Muslim advocates in our spaces, and really prioritize that as something that's also our commitment to addressing racial justice, right? So just as we're kind of in this new space and era of addressing any harm that we might be perpetuating with regards to anti-Blackness or racism, I would say that this could be kind of folded into that as well, because it is all very much linked.
Yazan, did you have anything you wanted to share?
No, just really grateful to be here, really grateful for the space. In sharing the report for MedAct, I also just found this interesting thing. It's a training on healthcare. It's a training on Prevent, which is a UK-based version of countering violent extremism, which is a surveillance program that a lot of us do work around. But I think that the work that this organization does might also be up the alley of a lot of people. Like if this subject matter interests you, I would look more into MedAct. They are a UK counterpart, so they do a lot of work that's UK specific. But I think the questions that they're asking and the strategies that they are trying to problem solve really relate to the work that's happening here in these different kinds of fields. So just wanted to uplift that, and wanted to name, if anyone wants to connect, I threw my email in the chat. And we're really excited that this happened and kind of wondering if we should continue these kinds of conversations together. This conversation is not a one and done. I think it takes a lot more time.
Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you to API-GBV for being here. For our closeout, we just have one question in the chat. It's also will be really helpful for us is if you could just share, one thing that you found super helpful in this workshop and that you will be taking with you to put into practice. So if you want to share that in the chat, that would be amazing. And with that, of course, we have deep gratitude to you all for being here and for the work that you all do and here to build in community moving forward. So yeah, just one thing that you found useful through this workshop that you will be implementing or using moving forward. Thank you. We're glad that you found that helpful. Yes, solid recommendation on the OVW piece. Move that to Department of Health. Yep, real practical. Yes, really important to outreach to Muslim communities. Thank you.